Picture the year 1541. Spanish conquistador Francisco Vasquez de Coronado is cutting through the unforgiving wilderness of what is now the Texas Panhandle. His army is ragged, hungry, and obsessed with a single fantasy, the mythical city of gold, El Dorado. But instead of gold, Coronado stumbled upon something that would prove far more valuable to any empire: a thriving, healthy, and remarkably well-fed indigenous people known as the Querechos. These were not people struggling to survive on the margins of civilization. They were flourishing, and they did it without a single farm, a single granary, or a single supply wagon. The Querechos moved freely across the plains, following the great buffalo herds with precision and purpose. They carried no excess, they wasted nothing. And their secret weapon, the thing that Coronado's chroniclers noted with confused admiration, was a compact, dark, dense food that seemed almost impossibly powerful for its size. This was pemmican. And what Coronado witnessed that day was not primitive survival. It was the most sophisticated food technology the pre-industrial world had ever produced. Think of pemmican as the original energy bar, but one engineered not by food scientists in a laboratory, but by centuries of field-tested life-or-death refinement. The Querechos and other plains tribes had no grain silos, no refrigeration, no preservatives from a chemical plant. What they had was pemmican, a dense blend of dried meat and rendered fat that could store months, sometimes years, worth of energy in a pouch small enough to carry on your belt. This is why historians have begun calling it the Indigenous Battery. Just as a modern battery stores electrical energy for later use, pemmican stored caloric energy in the most compact, stable, and transportable form ever devised by human ingenuity. The genius was not just in the ingredients, but in the process. Buffalo meat was sliced razor thin and dried under the sun or over fire until every molecule of moisture was gone. It was then pulverized, literally beaten into powder. Then came the fat, not just any fat, but specifically rendered kidney fat, the richest and most stable fat on the animal's body. The two were combined in equal parts, sometimes with dried berries for additional nutrients and flavor, and pressed into a compact brick or leather bag. The result was a food that required no cooking, no refrigeration, and no preparation. You simply ate it, and you had the energy to run, hunt, or march for hours. Let's talk about raw numbers, because this is where the story becomes almost unbelievable. 1 pound of standard ground beef contains roughly 1,500 calories. It takes refrigeration, cooking, and preparation. It spoils within days. 1 pound of pemmican, on the other hand, contains approximately 3,500 calories. It needs no refrigeration. It requires no cooking. It can last for years, sometimes decades. This is not a marginal improvement. This is more than double the caloric density of fresh meat, in a format that is infinitely more portable and indefinitely more shelf-stable. Consider what this means for someone living off the land. 1 small bag of pemmican, weighing just a few pounds, could sustain an adult through days of hard physical labor. For a hunting party covering vast distances across the Great Plains, this was not a convenience. It was the difference between life and death. The metabolic efficiency of pemmican's macronutrient profile, roughly 80% fat and 20% protein with 0 carbohydrates, also means the body burns it cleanly and steadily without the insulin spikes and crashes that come from carbohydrate-heavy foods. This is what nutritional scientists now call deep metabolic efficiency. The Querechos had unlocked it centuries before the concept had a name. Here's the question that stops most people cold. How does a meat product last 20 years without refrigeration? The answer lies in a concept food scientists call water activity reduction. All biological spoilage, bacterial growth mold, fermentation, decomposition, requires moisture to function. Bacteria cannot reproduce without water. Enzymes cannot break down proteins without water. The moment you eliminate moisture from a food environment, you essentially switch off the biological clock of decay. Pemmican accomplishes this through 2 simultaneous mechanisms. First, the meat is dried to absolute desiccation, not just dried out, but reduced to a state where there is virtually no free water remaining. Second, and this is the masterstroke, the rendered fat encases every particle of that dried meat in a hermetic seal. Fat is hydrophobic. It actively repels water. So even if humidity from the environment tries to re-enter the food, the fat seal blocks it at the molecular level. The result is what food scientists would call a natural vacuum seal, a biological fortress against the forces of decomposition. No laboratory was needed, no synthetic preservatives, just heat, time, and fat. Now contrast this ancient wisdom with the best that 20th century food science could offer. In 2006, during routine maintenance beneath the Brooklyn Bridge, workers discovered something extraordinary. A cache of 350,000 survival crackers, sealed in metal drums and left there during the height of the Cold War as emergency rations for civilians in the event of a nuclear attack. The crackers had been manufactured by the best food engineers of their era, wrapped in foil, stored in climate-controlled conditions, and stamped with an official government seal of approval. They were, by every modern standard of food preservation technology, state-of-the-art. When the workers opened the drums and tasted the crackers, the results were grim. The crackers tasted, by multiple accounts, like cardboard soaked in machine oil. Some who ate them reported nausea. The fat content had gone rancid. The crackers, designed specifically to keep people alive through the worst catastrophe imaginable, had failed at their only job. Meanwhile, in the archives of Arctic explorers and military historians, there are documented accounts of pemmican being eaten after 15 or 18, even 20 years in storage, with the tasters reporting it was perfectly palatable and fully nutritious. The irony is almost too sharp to bear. Modern food engineering, backed by government contracts and cutting-edge chemistry, produced something that rotted in a basement. The Lakota Nation, using nothing but fire and a buffalo, produced something that outlasted empires. To understand why pemmican triggered an actual war, you first have to understand what it meant for mobility. Before pemmican entered the supply chains of European explorers and fur traders in North America, movement through the continent's interior was brutally constrained. Expeditions had to carry enormous quantities of food, or they had to stop and hunt, losing days, sometimes weeks, to the business of feeding themselves. Supply wagons and canoe loads of provisions limited how far, how fast, and how long any expedition could go. Pemmican changed the mathematics of exploration entirely. With pemmican, a fur trader could travel light. A trapper could push deeper into unmapped territory than ever before. An entire company of men could move at the pace of the land itself, unburdened by the weight of conventional provisions. The great voyageurs of the Canadian fur trade, paddling 18-hour days across the lakes and rivers of the interior, ran on pemmican. It was the fuel that opened up North America to European commerce and conquest. Without it, the interior of the continent might have remained inaccessible for decades more, and this is where the story takes its most dramatic turn. By the early 19th century, pemmican had become so strategically critical to the North American fur trade that it became the object of a shooting war. In 1814, Miles Macdonell, the governor of the Red River Colony in what is now Manitoba, issued what became known as the Pemmican Proclamation, a unilateral ban on the export of pemmican from the region. His stated reason was to feed the struggling settlers of the colony, but his real target was the Northwest Company, the powerful fur trading enterprise that depended on pemmican to fuel its vast network of traders and trappers across the continent. By cutting off pemmican supply, Macdonell intended to cripple the Northwest Company's ability to move men and goods through the interior. It worked, briefly, but the response was swift and violent. The Métis people, who produced and traded much of the region's pemmican and whose livelihoods depended on it, rose in armed resistance. Skirmishes broke out. Supply depots were raided. Men were killed. The conflict, known to history as the Pemmican War, raged for years and contributed directly to the merger of the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company in 1821. A food preservation technique had triggered an armed geopolitical conflict and reshaped the corporate map of a continent. The military applications of pemmican were not lost on European powers. By the time of the Boer War in 1899, the British Army had formalized pemmican into what they called the Iron Ration, a compact emergency kit consisting of 4 ounces of pemmican and 4 ounces of chocolate. Soldiers issued with the Iron Ration could march for 36 consecutive hours without stopping to cook or resupply. Explorer Vilhjalmur Stephenson, who lived among the Inuit for extended periods in the early 20th century, documented tasting pemmican that had been stored for multiple years without refrigeration, and finding it completely wholesome and nutritious. The ancient formula required no modification. It simply worked. Walk into any outdoor retailer today, and you will find an entire aisle dedicated to survival food. Freeze-dried pouches, vacuum-sealed meal kits, emergency calorie bars, all marketed with the language of preparedness, self-reliance, and resilience. A standard pouch from a leading survival food brand will cost you around $12 and deliver approximately 300 calories. If you do the math, and most consumers never do, 3,500 calories, the caloric equivalent of 1 pound of pemmican, will cost you roughly $100 in freeze-dried commercial product. Now consider the cost of making pemmican yourself. Grass-fed beef, dried and rendered, combined with quality suet, will cost you approximately $2 per pound, the same pound that delivers those 3,500 calories. You are looking at a price differential of 50 to 1. The commercial survival food industry is selling you a 50 times markup on a product that is, by every measurable metric, inferior to a 1,000-year-old recipe that any person with a kitchen can produce at home. This is not a small discrepancy. This is a systemic and deliberate miseducation of the consumer about what genuine food security actually looks like. Here is the uncomfortable truth the industry does not advertise. Corporations cannot patent pemmican. The recipe is over 1,000 years old, documented in historical records, and belongs to no single inventor. It sits firmly in the public domain. And that means it is a direct competitive threat to the multi-billion-dollar survival food industry, a threat that cannot be neutralized through intellectual property law. So the industry has found another weapon, regulation. Under the USDA's cottage food laws, the sale of animal protein products from home or small-scale operations is tightly restricted or outright banned in the vast majority of American states, 43 by some counts. The practical effect of these regulations is to make it effectively illegal to sell pemmican commercially, unless you have the infrastructure, certifications, and capital of an industrial food operation. In Maine, legislators attempted to pass a food freedom law that would have allowed small producers to sell traditional foods like pemmican directly to consumers. Federal pressure and industry lobbying killed the bill. The ancient recipe that empires were built on is now, in most of America, illegal to sell, not because it is dangerous, but because it is too effective. In a world where corporations control your food supply, where survival is monetized and self-reliance is regulated out of existence, the most radical thing you can do is cook your own food. Not order it, not subscribe to it, not buy it in a plastic pouch with a 10-year shelf life promise and a $50 price tag. Make it yourself with your own hands, from ingredients you understand, using a process that has been proven across centuries and continents. Making pemmican is not just a practical act of preparedness. It is a philosophical statement. It is a refusal to outsource your survival to an industry that profits from your dependence. This is not romantic primitivism. This is not a rejection of modernity for its own sake. It is a recognition that somewhere in the relentless march of processed convenience food, we surrendered something genuinely valuable. Not just a recipe, but a relationship with food as medicine, food as fuel, food as freedom. The Quechos did not need a corporation to survive the Great Plains. The British Army did not need a freeze-dried pouch to march 36 hours through the Boer War. You do not need the survival food industry to be genuinely prepared. Start with the leanest cut of beef you can find, top round, eye of round, or venison if you have access to it. Fat in the meat itself is the enemy here, because it will go rancid far faster than rendered kidney fat. Slice the meat paper thin, against the grain, no thicker than a credit card. Lay the slices on a drying rack and place them in an oven at the lowest possible temperature, ideally around 150 to 170 degrees Fahrenheit, for 8 to 12 hours, until every trace of moisture is gone. You are looking for what bushcrafters call the snap test. The dried meat should snap clean like a dry twig when you bend it, not flex or bend. If it bends, it is not dry enough. Send it back in for another hour. Once the meat passes the snap test, let it cool completely and then pulverize it. A food processor works well. You want a coarse powder, not a paste. Meanwhile, render your kidney fat. Suet, sourced from around the kidneys or loins of the animal, is the gold standard. Cut it into small pieces and melt it slowly in a heavy pan over low heat until it is completely liquid and the solids have separated. Strain it through a fine mesh to remove any impurities. Let it cool slightly. You want it liquid, but not scalding. Then combine the meat powder and the liquid fat in a 1:1 ratio by weight. Mix thoroughly and pour the mixture into a mold or press it into bars. If desired, add dried berries. Cranberries, blueberries, or Saskatoons are traditional choices for additional micronutrients and flavor. A bushcrafter in Montana documented an experiment that cuts through every piece of industry marketing more effectively than any argument could. He made a batch of pemmican using traditional methods, sealed it in a glass jar, and stored it at room temperature for 18 months. At the 18-month mark, he opened the jar, examined the pemmican, smelled it, and ate it. His report was simple. It was perfectly good. No rancidity, no off flavors, no illness. Just food, dense, calorie-rich, shelf-stable food, made for approximately $2 a pound, waiting patiently for the moment it was needed. The survival food industry sells you fear. It sells you the idea that genuine preparedness requires their products, their technology, their subscription boxes and freeze-dried pouches and proprietary formulas. Pemmican is the answer to all of that. Not because it is exotic or ancient or romanticized by history, but because it simply works. It worked for the Quechos on the Texas plains. It worked for the voyageurs paddling 18 hours a day through the Canadian wilderness. It worked for soldiers in the Boer War and explorers in the Arctic. It will work for you. The empires of the ancient world were sustained by a recipe you can make in your kitchen this weekend. The only question is whether you will.